When we think of Jesus glorified, what do we usually think of? I dare say many, if not most, think of the resurrection, maybe the ascension, or some kind of heavenly image of Jesus reigning from his throne. But how often, when we think of the glorification of Jesus, do we think of the cross? I dare say even further that some people, not many, perhaps not even a lot, have told me that they really don't like images of the crucifix unless it is as bloody and as violent as they possibly could get it. Because as they see it, it looks more realistic, like someone dying from the cross. However, if you were to read the Gospel of John, such as what we have today in our Gospel reading, the glorification of Jesus is in the cross. John stands out among the other evangelists in that the cross is that moment of Christ's glorification. That cross is that moment of Christ's judgment. And we see that in the gospel today where, let's face it, it's not a very positive gospel. It begins with the prophecy of Judas betraying Jesus and ends with the prophecy of Peter denying Jesus. And which one's worse than the other, you're not exactly sure. But the linchpin of this entire gospel, the centerpiece, is when Jesus declares, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." And when does he say that? He says it once Judas has left. Once the wheels have been set in motion for him to be turned over and crucified, for him to be betrayed and condemned and to die. And it is when Judas leaves the room that Jesus says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." How often do we think of the cross as the glory of Jesus? And yet, in many ways, that is how John presents it. On Palm Sunday, which, by the way, we also refer to as Passion Sunday, we have the regular rotation of the gospel readings. This year we read from the Passion according to Matthew. Next year it will be Mark. And the following year, as it was last year, will be the Gospel of Luke. And Matthew and Mark especially, like to focus on the suffering Jesus from the cross. The very human Jesus who doesn't really want to go through this, who says, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done." The Jesus who cries from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But every year on Good Friday, there is no rotation. We read from the Passion according to John. And it's an important distinction to make. This is not Passion Sunday. This is Good Friday. And the focus on Good Friday is not Jesus suffering from the cross, but Jesus being glorified on the cross. The last thing John would have Jesus say is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The last thing John would have Jesus say is, "Father, let this cup pass from me." In fact, what Jesus says is something very different. He says, "The hour has come, and what am I to say? Father, let this cup pass from me?" It's almost a rhetorical question. You really think I'm going to say that? As we see in today's gospel, Jesus gives permission. He commands Judas. He commands Judas to go about to do what he's meant to do. When they come to arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane, he commands them. He orders them to arrest him. Because when they come and they say, he says, "Who are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." He says, "I am." They all fall flat on the ground in worship. He actually has to instruct them to do what they came to do. Unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in which Jesus is the silent, suffering servant who says virtually nothing at his trial, in John, he's the Messiah who won't shut up, who engages the Sanhedrin, who engages Pontius Pilate to the point of Pilate's frustration, because Pilate can't seem to figure this person out, and Jesus always has an answer for the things that are stated against him. And from the cross, he's not suffering. There's no indication that he is suffering, but rather he's on a judgment throne with the two witnesses also being crucified, one on either side of him. Neither of them say anything, but it is very much a judgment scene in the Gospel of John, in which he doesn't suffer from the cross, but rather he conducts unfinished business from the cross. Not the least of which is saying, "Mother, behold your son, son, behold your mother," which, by the way, folks, is not giving my mommy to my best friend, but declaring the mother, who's unidentified and never identified in the Gospel of John, the mother to be the symbol of all disciples and the church, and putting that church, symbolized in the mother, into the care of the beloved disciple, who symbolizes all disciples. And that is where we find the church today, in the care of the disciples of Christ. To fulfill Scripture, he says, "I thirst." A very deliberate word with a very deliberate purpose. And when he had sucked from the bitter wine or the bitter vinegar, it states in John's Gospel, when he had done this, he said, "It is finished," and dies. Very much a Messiah glorified on the cross, in command of his destiny, done in all things to fulfill the wish of his Father, who never abandons him, nor would he ever think the Father has abandoned him, nor would he ever express that the Father has abandoned him in the Gospel of John. And these are the actions, these are the events in which the Son of Man is glorified. And that glorification, in a part of John's Gospel that is called the Book of Glory, is not simply in the resurrection, but first and foremost from the cross. Not an image of violence, but an image of glory. And that's why I always like to tell folks, if you insist on watching Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, a film I have never seen and will never see, I don't seem to think we need to see that kind of violence in order to be inspired. Passion Sunday is the day to see Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. On Good Friday, we will not be focusing on the passion and the violence and the suffering. We call that Friday good because we are focusing on the glorification of the Son of Man from the cross, reigning from his throne, finishing unfinished business, and ultimately, willingly, defiantly fulfilling the will of his heavenly Father. So today we see just the beginning. Judas Iscariot leaves the company of apostles to begin what he is meant to do. And it is at that point that Jesus lifts his eyes to heaven and says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified."